Hey, everyone. All right. So my personal website is veronicao.com. And on social media, Instagram and Twitter, I am at Veronica O. Davis. Let's see. So a little bit more about me, for those of you that read the book or didn't read the book. I will provide a little bit more context around some of the items that are in my book. But a little bit more about me is I am from a little town called Maplewood, New Jersey. This is a slightly older photo because many right now post-COVID, many of these parking spaces have been removed for streeteries. There's a lot of restaurants, locally owned restaurants along this particular block. So a lot of the parking is actually gone, but this is more of what reflective of what it looked like for me growing up. Very low speeds as a child. We walked to middle school and elementary school and all of those things. I had the freedom to be able to get to the ice cream store because it was very safe. No one was going to hit you. I I cannot recall in my lifetime any crashes or anything like that that occurred in the downtown area because the speeds were just that slow. And it was very much an understanding that you stop and you don't run over people. And so that definitely formed my identity. And Maplewood, New Jersey, for those of you that don't know, it is right outside of New York City. You all are younger, so you might know SZA. So she went to my high school, Lauryn Hill, which produced the album The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill. She went to my high school. And Andrew and Elizabeth Shue, if you ever watched Don't Tell Mom the Babysitter's Dead, that is Elizabeth Shue. They also went to my high school. As mentioned, I am one of the co-founders of Black Women Bike. Ironically, I actually don't like biking for exercise. I do have a Peloton now that I force myself to get on, but I actually prefer to bike very slowly to get places. I started biking because I started a company, and when you start a company, the money doesn't roll like it needs to roll. And so I gave up my car for a bicycle because it would be cheaper. And that is how I got around DC really up until almost I was, until I got pregnant. That's how most I got around DC, either biking or public transportation. And so really kind of unintentionally, accidentally founded this organization with two other women. And, really becoming an advocacy organization. Although you see here, we're in spandex and kitted out. I'm actually not in this photo, I'm taking the photo. But, it really was about helping women bike for whatever reason. So whether it's for transportation, exercise, fun, like just getting women on bikes. And then the other important part of the organization was advocacy, was advocating for better bike infrastructure in the communities for which we lived. And one of the kind of outcomes of Black Women Bike at the time, I was in my 30s and I was one of the younger members. We actually attracted a lot of young retirees. So women who were in their late 50s, early 60s, who were under the older government systems that were able to retire. That's who we attracted, where they wanted to stay active. They wanted to reduce their, their living expenses because now they were on fixed income. And many of them have gone on to become certified cycling instructors and getting their friends on bikes. And so it's been really great to grow the movement and see older women who some hadn't been on a bike in 30, 40 years, getting on a bike and becoming active. This is me as a child. I always include a picture of me as a child, but this is me. I may or may not have hit my cousin who's in the corner on a bicycle. But it talks about, the reason why I put this up too is remembering that, car culture starts young. I had my VW, is a Volkswagen Rabbit that we drove around, but I have since become a better driver and I don't hit people anymore. And in my bio, it mentioned I was the director of transportation and drainage operations. However, as of January, I am no longer in that position. And so these type of positions are technical, but also very political. So I was not civil service protected, and we had a new mayor that came in January, and I was thanked for my services to the citizens of Houston. But I will say I don't have any regrets. for any of the work that I did during my tenure and the leadership of my team. It's just the new mayor has a different philosophy. He's more car-centric. And so I did not fit in that new vision and that new model. But I'm okay. This is me. If you follow me on social media, you will see that I am playing outside. I am taking this time to take a lot of rest. As mentioned, it is a big job. I had 900 employees. The city of Houston is physically large. The city of Houston is 671 square miles, which is about the size of a typical East Coast county. But I didn't have that budget to match. And I did have responsibility for planning, design, construction, operations, and maintenance. So with you're in a 24/7 role, you never really get to relax. So I'm enjoying my time relaxing, and this is me being great. And so moving on, so I know many of you all have the book. And so this is just the table of contents. And if you haven't had a chance to read it, just the big picture overview. The foreword is by Tamika Butler. I know some of you may know Tamika. And I'm really glad that she was able to write the foreword for me, a very good friend, part of my brain and my heart trust. In the preface, I talk a little bit about what it was like to go through the writing experience, particularly since I originally started this book prior to COVID and having to make the adjustments as we're in COVID. And in the introduction, I talk about the state of the industry, where we are, the fact that we are really still struggling with the decisions of the past. And even with technology, we're applying new technology to old ways of thinking. So it's not really solving the problem. And then I have the main chapters, and each chapter is structured where there's a thought, kind of my manifesto, if you will. But I also give you as a reader opportunities for reflection. So chapter 1, transportation is personal. I'll go into a little bit more details with that this morning. Chapter 2, equity is more than a baseball graphic. Chapter 3 is the war on cars, and 2 and 3 really are complementary chapters of each other that go into a little bit more detail of how we got to where we are today and the outcomes of that. When we look at where people are dying on our roadways and seriously injured, when we look at childhood asthma, obesity, all of these things are very much related to how we built our transportation network. Chapter 4 is power, influence, and the complexity of people. So I'll dig into that a little bit. Chapter 5 is bringing it all together, and then chapter 6, call to action. And so I will dig into that. So mostly today, I'll talk about chapters 1, 4, and 6. So how we designed our systems. This is going to be a little bit more of a detailed history lesson than what is in the book, but I will bring elements of the book into this conversation. And so I know, how many of you ever heard the term American Dream? If you can raise your hand, if you've ever heard the term at all. Okay, most hands are up. So it's very interesting, the American Dream. In 1931, this is one of the first references of American Dream by a gentleman named James Truesdale Adams. And so what he had a vision for the American Dream was life should be better and richer and fuller for everyone, with opportunity for each according to ability or their achievement. And that was what the original vision of the American Dream. However, this is just a screen grab from Google. If you actually Google American Dream ads, you will get a very different perception of what the American Dream was. And so this is literally just a screen grab of Google. And mostly what you see in these ads are white families with a little boy, a little girl, a husband, a wife, and they have some type of an animal, whether it's a cat or a dog. They're either going to be in a vehicle or standing outside of a suburban house with the white picket fence. And so that was truly the vision that was being sold as the American Dream. And there was many people who were excluded from that dream. This is the one photo you can find with people of color as you Google. And this is from 1937. And in the backdrop, again, this ad for the American Dream, where it says world's highest standard of living. There's no way like the American way. And in the foreground, you see people of color standing in line, attempting to get food. And again, it's this juxtaposition of this vision of what the American Dream was and those that were left out of the American Dream. And so this is where it's very important to talk about history. And so I'm just going to give a very high level segregation timeline. There's plenty of resources out there where you all can dig a little bit deeper. And so when you look at segregation, so the Civil War ended 1865. And that was when we started the Reconstruction period of the United States, where we were attempting to recover from just being at war with ourselves. And so that was 1865. In 1896, you have the first one of the cases, the court cases, Plessy versus Ferguson. So Homer Plessy was only I think he was 1/8 Black, but this is the time where you had the one drop rule. So even one drop of Black blood made you Black, even if you were white presenting. But Homer Plessy attempted to board a white only rail car and was told he couldn't. And so he went all the way to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court affirmed in 1896 separate but equal doctrine. So this is now where you are in what many call the Jim Crow era of separate but equal. And segregation was essentially held up by the Supreme Court of the United States as a legal doctrine. So 1954 is when then you have the Brown versus Board of Education. And that quote unquote ended segregation. And I say ended segregation. So even though the Supreme Court under the 14th Amendment ended segregation, for these kids to be able to go to school, that's where you see the photos of, the Arkansas 9, where they're attempting to go to school under this new kind of legalized, environment, but they have to be escorted by the National Guard in order to even be able to just go to school. And then you have 1964, and that is the Civil Rights Act, which really, quote unquote, ended segregation. And again, it was the 14th Amendment was held up, which is the same 14th Amendment. And I won't go too deep into it of Roe versus Wade, and really other doctrine came under that. And so it's important to have this timeline because this is where you have the really systemic segregation. So this is a red line map of Houston from 1930s, where it was very legal to segregate. And so you'll see these colorized maps of different cities. And so what redlining was the identification of communities that were considered desirable, communities that were considered less desirable. And so you had the real estate community determining where people could and could not live. And so there is a very interesting congressional hearing with the Real Estate Association talking about their role in creating segregation. The other part of this are the protected covenants and deed restrictions. So one of the things that's very important about history is that you cannot look at history with a today lens. So in today's lens, if someone is Irish, if someone is Italian, if someone is Jewish, Polish, we would consider them white. But in 1930, there were protective covenants against these particular groups of people. So it's very important to just keep that in the back of your mind, that white was very specific during that time period. And it was usually where we get the term WASP, white, Anglo-Saxon, and Protestant. That was who was considered white. So this is Los Angeles. This is your redlining map. Again, in this case, red was considered less desirable. Blue and the greens were considered the most desirable. And so that is how we ended up with a segregated cities across the United States. And even in this map in the 1930s, where you see the red, a lot of those communities are mixed, where they are Black, Asian American, and white. But again, in that case, white for that time period, it's usually people of Italian descent, not what we would consider white today. And this is just an example from Springfield, Massachusetts, of a protective covenant. And in this case, it was, that this house should not be sold to someone who was colored, Polander, or an Italian. And you'll see these, they're still today, people will find on their deeds this type of language. They are not legally enforceable. And I know even in the state of Texas, there was a law created that they're not legally enforceable. And to ease the cleaning up of deeds, they created a process, but there are still very much deeds across the United States today that still have some forms of these types of language. And so all of that is important to set the stage for the highways. Because I want to make it clear, I know that there are times that people want to rewrite history or claim things weren't so, but all of these things get us to the highway timeline. So 1916 was the Federal Road Act, and that is what began to create the federal kind of aid, but there was no funding put behind it. In 1939 is the first time interstate is described in Congress. At that time, it was the Bureau of Public Roads. So that is the predecessor to today's Federal Highway Administration. 1944 is the first Federal Aid Highway Act. But 1956, this is under President Dwight Eisenhower, is really what established the funding for the highways. So you're talking about 1956. We're in the middle of segregation. We're in the middle of redlining. We're in the middle of protective covenants. So all of that is the backdrop for establishing the highway system. And so this is where I share my story. In chapter 1, I talk about transportation as personal. So this is a 1960 map of Baton Rouge, of East Baton Rouge, where they were planning the Louisiana government, along with the federal government, were planning Interstate I-10, which today connects California to Florida east-west. And so this is a shaded map where planners were trying to figure out, where do we put this highway? This neighborhood at this time was Black and Italian, kind of average income at the time. It wasn't a low-income neighborhood, average income for that time period, but it was Black and Italian. And so this particular parcel, where you see the arrows pointing, on the front part of the parcel was my great-grandmother's house. And the back part of the parcel was my grandparents' and my mother's house. So my mother lived in that house all the way through high school. And that was, and the parcels all on that particular property, again, it was a Black and Italian neighborhood. But my family's house was taken in order to build Interstate 10. Although the interesting thing about my grandmother's house, so this is a photo on the left is provided by my mom. It has my uncle standing in the front of the house. But as a child, I visited that house. So that house existed until I was probably about 9 or 10. And then my grandparents sold the house to the corner store. So only the corner store, my great-grandmother's house remained. So they sold my grandmother's house to the corner store and relocated my great-grandmother to live with them. But as a child, I visited this house, and I remember visiting my great-grandmother's house underneath the highway. Unfortunately, we couldn't find a photo, but there is a photo where her house is literally under the highway. And on the right is a photo from 2022 to show what it looks like today. And so the neighborhood has pretty much been decimated at this point. The houses are gone. People have been relocated. And so this is just an aerial today of where my great-grandmother's house would have been. So that's the corner store that still exists today. And so their house is right next to it underneath the highway. But also very important, I think I have definitely had my share of challenges with churches as I've tried to implement projects. So St. Francis Xavier Church is our family's church. And so one of the things, as you all work in different communities and you have religious institutions, particularly for older generations, even though they move away, that is still the family's religious anchor. And so St. Francis Xavier Church, my family lived, it was a 5-minute walk to church, and they were relocated to the west side of Baton Rouge. So it became about a 20-minute drive, and that's what it is today, in order to get to church. But that is still the family church. So if you are in my mother's side of the family and you die, you will be funeralized at this church. That is our family church. Doesn't matter where you live, that is where your funeral is going to be. And that is, and oftentimes in communities and cities, a challenge becomes church parking, or, for synagogues, it's parking on the weekends. Well, depending if they're Orthodox or not. But, parking becomes one of the big challenges, and largely it's because people have been displaced to outer parts, but they still come back to their family's place of worship. And so chapter 4, that gets to us where we are today. And so that particular neighborhood today has high childhood asthma, high obesity, and all of the things that, we talk about, and we talk about the impacts. So the theoretical framework that I talk about in chapter 4 is power and privilege. And power is defined as the ability to direct laws, policies, and investments that shape people's lives. So in my previous job, I had a lot of power. I didn't have ultimate power, but I had a lot of power and access to power. It's a strong mayor form of government. And so I had a lot of influence over the decision making. And there's a lot of privilege that comes with that. And privilege is the accumulation of benefits and special rights. And it's going to look like a lot of things. And so with this, there are 4 stakeholders I talk about in the book. So people in power, those may be your elected officials. Those may be your department directors, whether it's the planning department, transportation, maybe a public works. But those are the people in power. They have the ability to make decisions that impact communities. In the middle, there are these champions and naysayers, and their power and influence is going to fluctuate depending on who's in power. It's going to fluctuate depending on the vision of those in power, but different things. And I know the champions and the naysayers don't like when I put them together, but they're really, the same sides of, different sides of the same coin, in that these are the people, when you have public meetings, they show up. They're going to be passionately for or passionately against a project, regardless of whatever it is. And really, they're the ones that have the time, effort, and energy to show up and be focused. And there's a privilege that they have because they have the opportunity to go to these meetings, again, because they have time, they have money, or a combination of both. But in the corner is what I call silently suffering. And these are the people that have low power and low influence, and largely because this group is just trying to get through the day. This is the group when people say nobody bikes, they are absolutely biking. The problem is they're not biking during a traditional rush hour. Many may be shift workers, and so they're biking early in the morning or midday or very late at night. When we look at COVID, the silently suffering were absolutely impacted. When you look at the language around COVID, we talked about essential workers, but we took that to mean the doctors, the nurses that were taking care of the people who had COVID. But no one talked about the janitorial staff that were making sure that the hospitals were cleaned. No one was talking about the grocery staff that were making sure that shelves were stocked. And the people that those of us that were able to work from home could have our groceries delivered to our door. But often we shut down the public transportation system because people were working from home, but we completely forgot about all of the people who are dependent on the transportation system, the public transportation system, and people who do not have the ability to work from home. And many were stranded. Many had to resort to Ubers or biking or other forms just to get to work. And so that's what I mean by silently suffering, because oftentimes when we are making decisions, that is not who we're thinking about. Our language doesn't do that. And so in my role at the city of Houston, I did my best to always center this group of, am I making the decision that is best for them or best for the champions and the naysayers? And it's very hard because often that group is not going to come to a public meeting because they're working or they're trying to just survive the day. But it's not that things are not important to them. It's just other things are more important. And so I hope that as you all have your careers, that you're really looking out for this particular group. And what does that begin to look like? So this is a photo that I took in Tucson. So this is a very wide road. This is a lower income neighborhood. The speeds were very fast, and you have a bus stop stopping on what feels almost like a highway. And there's a person that's standing on a sidewalk. There's no buffer between the road and the sidewalk, and this person is standing there waiting for their child. When I talk about the silently suffering, this is a picture from Houston. So one of the things about Houston is Houston is a very flat city. And so the drainage system is very sensitive. And so this is an open ditch neighborhood. But here you have a person, a citizen, who is using a wheelchair in the middle of the street because there are no sidewalks. And I know you may say, well, you were the director of transportation. Why doesn't she have sidewalks? Sidewalks by ordinance in Houston are the abutting property owner's responsibility to install and maintain. And so this is a lower income neighborhood. And so it's their responsibility to install and maintain. This is an open ditch neighborhood, which the installation of sidewalks is about 3 times the amount of the installation in a closed drainage system. So we've made it expensive, we've made it their responsibility. And so now this person is riding in the middle of the street in order to get to the bus stop, in order to get to where they need to go. And so that is what we mean by silently suffering. It's another example. This is Charleston, South Carolina, where this person was actually walking to the bus. So we put bus stops on these major routes, and we don't provide sidewalks to facilitate the movement there. There's no sidewalk. So they're walking out of the driveway, and then she actually walks in the middle of the street in order to get to a bus stop. And even when we have a complete street, so this is Rockville, Maryland. So this is what many would call a complete street. There's a sidewalk. There is a buffer between the edge of road and the sidewalk. Although it's small, it is there. You have a very wide street. There is transit on this street, but this is the typical street that you will see on the high injury network. And the reason is that you have a lot of distance between where people are able to cross safely. And usually where the bus stops are located on a street like this are in the middle of the block. And so human nature is, my bus is coming, the next bus isn't coming for 20, 30 minutes. I need to get to work on time, or I need to go pick up my child from daycare. And so what happens is people dart right in the middle of the block, and usually they are struck and killed. And in the newspaper report after, we will say the person was not in a crosswalk, but we haven't facilitated safe movement. And even for this person wanted to cross at a signalized intersection, usually it's going to be a half a mile out of their way. And so for someone who may have limited mobility, that is extremely inconvenient. So this is a typical road that you will see on the high injury network. And I will tell you, I could look at any city. If you give me basic data points, I can tell you where the high injury network is. I can tell you where the Black and brown and or low income community is, because it typically is all going to overlap, and it's going to be these wide roads. And so, and that's where in chapter 6, the call to action. So I am going to try to leave you on a high note of a vision of where we could be if we made it the investments that we needed to invest in. And so these are some photos I will share of my travels, of how other countries view complete streets. And one of the things that I open up with in my book is, if you show me a transportation network, I can tell you what your community values. So this is the Netherlands. And while I know Amsterdam is known for biking, I actually can say, I think their transit system, their public transit system is probably one of the best that I had an opportunity to use. I don't know a lick of Dutch. I don't know how to sound about, I don't know how to say hello in Dutch. I know nothing of the Dutch language, but I was able to navigate their public transit system very easily. Even in the midweek, in the middle of the night, their trains were running on 5-6 minute headways, where in the United States, you're lucky if you can get a 20-minute headway during rush hour. So it's very convenient. And even moving between trams, it was very convenient. So when the Netherlands says we want a complete street, this is their vision of a complete street. So this is the same road, just at a different angle. And so what you have are really great wide sidewalks for people to walk. You have bike infrastructure for people to bike, a nice wide bike lane. You have places for people to drive. So it's not anti-car that everyone feels like Amsterdam is. There are places for people to drive, and that's defined space, and places for people to park. And then you have the public transportation system. So when you look at a complete street, this is Amsterdam's version versus our complete street in Rockville had the same elements, but it didn't look or feel remotely the same. This is Cali, Colombia. I know that a lot of people are starting to visit Colombia more, and they go to Cartagena or Bogota or Medellin. And I'm going to say this about Bogota. Was it Gil Penalosa, who is the former mayor, does a great job of pumping up Bogota. And Bogota has a really great bus rapid transit system, where they don't tell you it's in the middle of a very wide road. But what's so impressive about Cali, this is their bus rapid transit system, but where we can pride ourselves in the United States on a bus-only street, a bus-only road, they have a bus only street. So only buses are on this street. There are no cars. So what they've done is just taken a street and made it bus only. This is the transit stop where they've taken a lane and a little bit more of traffic in order to put a transit stop in the middle of the street. And there's walking. And so there's a little bit of a grade differential. So I think they have some work to do for their accessibility. But overall, it was a really great walking experience in Cali. They also have really great bike infrastructure. And what's also pretty cool, and I didn't get a picture of it, so now I have to go back to Cali, is on the other side of this train station, there's another street that's pedestrian only that has a lot of local vendors. And so they've taken transit oriented development to mean that local vendors have a place that they can be and they can sell their goods. So it's right there on the other side of the station. So go to Cali if you ever get a chance. And then last photo, and then I'm definitely open up for questions and discussion, is Brussels. So Brussels is my sleeper European city. I know Paris gets a lot of love, but go to Brussels. So this is a photo I took in Brussels in the downtown area, and there's no cars at all. And so what was great from an experience is you don't realize how quiet cities are when there's no cars. There's a bunch of cafes along this area where you can sit and people watch, and there's no cars. So it is really one of my favorite cities to visit, to be able to walk around, to move, to navigate. Brussels also has a really great public transit system. And so with that, I will open it up to any questions, comments that you all have.